when people deal with a philosopher, even at the academy, unfortunately, very often they only focus on what he said, what was the content of his thinking, and not so much on his methods. So how did he get to saying these things? But I believe that to be a very important question. For one, it helps us better understanding that philosopher, better understanding why he said what he said. But also, it can help us for our own thinking in our own life, because his methods might actually be good methods of thinking that are worth taking up for yourself. And especially when it comes to Kant, I believe both to be the case. I believe that you can only really understand Kant if you understand the methods he used. And I also believe that his methods have a certain value that goes beyond Kant's specific philosophy, and that they should be taken up by us. When it comes to his methods, he has a scientific method, and he has a method or three interconnected methods of thinking and of finding the truth. His scientific method is the architectonic, because, as I explained in another video on what is philosophy to Kant, science to him is systematic cognition. It should not just be an aggregate of cognitions, of knowledge that is thrown together like on a pile of sand. It should be a system, like an organic body. To Kant, that means that in an aggregate, the parts come first. The parts are contingent, and only because you happen to bring these parts together do you get a whole, in which the parts and their places in the whole are not necessary. A system, on the other hand, to Kant means that the whole, or the idea of the whole, is there first, and the parts come from the whole. They are necessary as parts of this whole, and so is their place in this whole. And that is exactly what is true for architectonic. When you build a house or a pyramid, you first have the idea of the whole, the architectonic plan of the building you want to build, and the parts that you need are necessary within that whole. And so Kant says, in science, we should not just go out there and try to find new data and new knowledge, because then we never know if we have found it all, or if there are still gaps in our knowledge that need to be filled. And also, we never even know what we are looking for and where to look. Rather, in science, there should first, in each individual science, be an idea of that science. And from that idea springs an architectonic plan of that science, of the various subfields that science will have, of the question that science must concern itself with, of the methods that science may use. And from this architectonic, you can then do that science, because now you know what you ought to do in that science. Now you know what your questions are, where to look for the answers. You know when there's still a gap, when that science, by its architectonic plan, through its idea, demands a certain question be answered, but it hasn't yet been answered. And this especially is the job of the philosopher to Kant, because, as I explained in my other video on what is philosophy, the philosopher, according to the world concept, to Kant is the wise man, the sage, and his job is being the lawgiver of reason. The regular scientists to Kant are technicians of reason. They know how to use reason to go to certain goals, but the philosopher is the one giving the laws, so he's the one setting the goals. And that is why in the science, the philosopher is like the architect making the plan, and the specific scientists in each field, they should be like the workers who actually build the building, but working according to the architect's plan. Well, and then on the other hand, as I said, Kant has a method for thinking and for finding truth. And he actually has three methods: the skeptical, the critical, and the sympathetic method. But you could look at them as being 3 steps of one and the same method. Because it all starts from the question, how is it even possible to make errors, to go wrong, to believe that something untrue is true? Well, Kant says all our cognition comes from the senses or from the intellect, from thinking. The senses as such can never be wrong. Not because they are always right, but because they simply make no judgment at all. When I see something, it doesn't matter if it's a real thing or if I'm hallucinating. The seeing as such is what I see. I can't be wrong about seeing that. So it is the intellect which makes errors. But the intellect as such also can't go wrong, Kant says. It can only go wrong when dealing with the senses in the wrong way. That is, when we forget our subjective perspective and treat it as something objective, as something absolute. So, for example, let's say you stand in front of a house and you see it from one side and you see that this side is red, and now that is all the data you get from your senses. But if now your intellect judges the whole house to be red, that might be wrong. The other sides of the house might have another color. And here, your intellect is basing a judgment on this limited subjective perspective, having only seen one side of the house and forgetting this limitation. Kant says that our judgments are either preliminary judgments or they are determining judgments. In the preliminary judgment, that is, for example, when I say the house might be red. I have only seen one side, that side was red, so the whole house might be red. Or that is when I have read one book of an author and it was good, and now he's publishing another book, and I say the other book might be good too, since his last book was good. But a determining judgment is when I then have tested that further, when I've looked further into the matter, and now I decide this really is how it is. The house really is red, or the book really is good. And to Kant, here is where errors occur. When we take our preliminary judgments and right away treat them as determining judgments without checking further. And this, by the way, is also where prejudice happens, because prejudice to Kant is a certain rule according to which I always take my preliminary judgments as determining judgments without checking further if they really were right or if I should rather adjust and change them. And this is what leads to the 3 methods of thinking that Kant has. The first is the skeptical method. And it is basically about being mindful of the fact that your preliminary judgments are only preliminary. You should suspend your determining judgment until you have further inquired into the matter. So, staying within the example, just because you saw one side of the house being red, you should not immediately jump to the conclusion that the whole house is red, but rather you should suspend making any judgment about the whole color at all until, for example, you have walked around the whole house and seen all its sides. And in this skeptical method, it is very important, Kant says, to not just suspend our judgment to look for further arguments, but also we should not just try to find arguments for our side, but we should try to find arguments for the opposing side. We should try finding arguments why we might be wrong. We should try to not strawman, but steelman the other side and make it as strong as possible. So basically, the skeptical method is about acting like a judge in court, who should not immediately decide if someone is guilty or innocent, but who should suspend his judgment until he has heard all the evidence and only then make a more informed judgment. The second method is the critical method. The critical method is about going to the source of an opinion, going to the source of a judgment. So asking, what is the principle out of which this judgment arose? and we should ask that with our own judgment and with other people's judgments. So if I say the house is wet, I should ask, out of which source have I come to judging the house to be wet? And then I realize, wait, I believe the house is wet because I have seen it from one side and that side was wet. But now, since I find the source, the principle of my judgment, I can also judge if that source even allows me to make that judgment, if that judgment is justified based on that principle. And here in the example, I will say, no, it's not justified. If I judge the whole house to be wet, but I only base it on having seen one side of the house, I might be wrong. Seeing one side of the house only allows me to judge that one side. So this is what we should always do, because Kant says, if someone goes wrong, if someone makes an error, he must still have a reason for going wrong. What he believes to be true must seem true to him, even if it isn't. So we must find the principle from which he made this judgment to understand the source of his illusion, to understand why something untrue might appear to be true, might seem to be true to him. And this is helpful, Kant says, when dealing with our own opinions and other people's opinions. First off, it allows us to better disprove an opponent. And not just that, maybe it also allows us to better convince him. So if, for example, someone believes a stage magician to be a real wizard with real magical powers, I can give all sorts of arguments why that's impossible and why there's no magic and so on. But still, the illusion may seem so real for that person that my arguments might not convince him. But if I can go to the source of his illusion, if I can see why this magic seems so real to him and show him how the tricks are done, show him that I can do the same tricks and even he can learn the tricks and do the same tricks and appear to have the same magical powers, then that will probably convince him better than any argument about magic not being real. Because now he has seen the source of his illusion, and that is what lifts his illusion. But also, this critical method is helpful, Kant says, because only through this can I really be convinced of my own position. Just having arguments to disprove the other side is not enough, because the other side has probably also got some arguments to disprove my position. How can I be sure that they are the ones under an illusion and not me? If, however, I can explain not just that they are wrong and how they are wrong, but also why they are wrong, what the source of their illusion is, what is the principle out of which something wrong seems to be right to them. If I can explain that, then I can be way more assured that they really are wrong and it's not me who is under an illusion. And lastly, this leads to the sympathetic method. Kant says we should always have sympathy with our fellow human beings, and when seeking truth, we should fight not as enemies but as friends who in the end have the same goal, that is finding the truth. It should not be about winning, about being right, winning an argument. It should be about finding what is true. And when someone else is wrong, we should not gloat about that. We should not be happy to own them. Rather, we should be somewhat sad and sympathetic because they are a fellow human being, and it is a sad thing when a human being goes wrong. And in arguing, we must assume, Kant says, that our opponent is not completely stupid, or if it's a moral question, we must assume he's not completely evil. Because no physician can bring a dead person back to life. He can only help someone who still has some life force to become stronger, to become more alive again. So if we really believed someone else to be completely stupid or completely evil, then we would be stupid for still arguing with them, because then we could not change their opinion or change their evil actions. We must assume that there is some prudence we must assume that there's some intelligence or some goodness in them, if we want to change them and convince them. And so we should try to speak to that, and not so much to their errors and their evilness. But especially, this sympathetic method is about finding a sort of middle position between two opposing positions. Because if you assume that no one can be completely and absolutely wrong, because an absolute error would be apparent as an absolute error, like no one would believe in it. If something seems to be true for someone, then it must at least be partially true. It must be true at least from some perspective, or else it could not create the illusion of being true. And so Kant says the sympathetic method is about finding that partial truth, not throwing away an opposing position, even if in the end it is wrong, not throwing it away completely, but finding what is true in it and combining it with your position to get to assert a better position. Especially, Kant says, when there are two opposing opinions on a matter, and on both sides there are smart people with no personal interest, with no personal ideology or so on, then you should assume that both sides are somewhat right from a certain perspective. And then you should not just throw away one side completely and go over to the other side completely, but rather you should try to find the partial truth in both positions, and you should try to combine them into a new position. So going back to the earlier example, if you stand on one side of the house and you say it's completely red, because your side looks red, and on the other side there's someone who says, no, the house is completely green, you should not just say, you idiot, you are clearly colorblind, it's clearly all red. Rather, you should ask yourself, well, what might be the partial truth in his position? He is standing on another side that I am not seeing. Maybe from that perspective, the house really does seem to be green. And so you arrive at a third middle position. You are now saying the house is neither completely red nor completely green, but rather the house has different colors on different sides. And so you combined the truth of both positions, and you put away the error of both positions, and that way you got to the actual truth. Now, apart from these four methods, Kant also gives some tips and advice on how to read books. He gives many. I won't go into all the details of which books to pick and when and how to read them. But mainly what Kant says is you should employ exactly these methods when reading. So you should be skeptical, not in the way of not trusting the author at all, but rather in the way of not disagreeing right away if you read one thing that you don't agree with, but rather suspending your judgment, not saying, oh, what an idiot who wrote that, suspending your judgment and trying to steelman that author, to make his position as strong as possible, to find possible further arguments why he might be right, apart from those he has given. Also, employing the critical method, so asking yourself from what principles does the author come from, and if you believe he is wrong, don't just bring arguments why he is wrong. Explain his illusion. Explain what must have been his perspective that made what is ultimately wrong seem to be true to him. And lastly, be sympathetic with the author. It's sad if he went wrong. Don't just throw him away completely. Rather, try to find the partial truth in his writing. Try to find what may have value in an otherwise incorrect text, and to retain that thing which has value and to combine it with your own position, to learn at least from that, no matter how small that partial truth may be. But most of all, what Kant recommends when reading is focusing first on the idea of the author. that is something that unfortunately is rarely done nowadays, not just when reading philosophical texts, but in general. Kant says you should not so much focus on the details at first, on certain opinions the author may hold, or on specific arguments he gives and whether those arguments are correct or incorrect. That you may focus on when reading the book again, because a good book, Kant says, should be read more than one time. But at first, you should try to understand his basic idea. And that idea may have value even if it is not presented in the best or most convincing manner, or even if the arguments for the idea are wrong in the end. Even if the idea itself is wrong. Kant says it is better to read a work of genius that gives you new perspectives, new ideas that can expand your own thinking, so that maybe you can find more true ideas than the one in this wrong but still inspiring book. It is better to do that than to read some book that is true but trivial and doesn't bring you any new perspectives. But what is important, Kant says, is first understanding an author's idea, understanding what he really wanted, what he was about, even if you can, understanding him better than he understood himself. And then you can try to make that idea as strong as possible. Be sympathetic with the author. So if he went wrong in the details or in some footnote, or if he gave a wrong idea for that, a wrong argument for that idea, sort of overlook that. Rather try to, in your head, come up with better arguments that the author didn't give but should have given, to make him, his position, his idea as strong as possible, and to take away as much as you can from that author. Now, that was a brief overview. If you want this in more details and with more examples and more detailed explanations, I have made specific videos about all 4 of these methods, and also a 5th video about how Kant says you should read. So if you're interested in that, you can check those out.